What's up guys, my name's Stu, and today we're going to be going over science and control builds in Star Trek Online. Oh, holy crap, this thing gets warm fast. Okay, we'll do this instead. I'm getting prescription lenses put in my normal sunglasses, which is great because I'll be able to see out of them better, but it also means I'm not going to have them for about a week. I thought this would be a funny substitute, and it was, but no, this is way too warm, so nope, maybe some other time. Anyway, EPG and control builds, that's why we're here. You know those crazy, super sciencey space magic builds that you see sometimes in random TFOs? Those are EPG builds usually. EPG builds can be pretty weird in comparison to most other build types, and I'll show you why. EPG builds are pretty different from other build types. Others are usually focused around a certain weapons type. Energy weapon builds are always focused on some type of beam or cannon. Torpedo builds are focused on torpedoes and mines. Weapons are even a large part of tank builds because fire at will is a large part of generating aggro. But science builds are typically focused around exotic damage. Now, when I say science builds, I mean EPG builds, control builds, DEW-Sci builds, drain builds, anything that's really science focused. These build types are generalized as science builds not because they're better suited to science characters, but because they use a lot of science bridge officer abilities and therefore are better suited to science vessels, especially ones with a secondary deflector. Now, these builds, EPG builds in particular, revolve around exotic damage. Exotic damage is any damage type that isn't a typical damage weapon type. So things like phaser, disruptor, kinetic, these are weapon damage types. Exotic damage is stuff like radiation, physical, cold, electrical damage, stuff like that. These can come from console abilities, bridge officer abilities, even certain weapons have procs or special effects that deal exotic damage. Since you're going to be more focused on generating exotic damage, your actual weapons damage isn't going to be nearly as important. While energy weapons thrive off of weapons power, a lot of your science abilities are going to depend on auxiliary power, so you're going to want to keep that maxed out at all times. How you divide up the rest of your power is going to depend a bit more on your build. For your captain specializations, you'll want to use temporal as your primary. You'll definitely want entropic rider for these science builds. Temporal crosswing is going to be pretty nice for a DEW-Sci build, and continuity is definitely great for survival. But ultimately, you want temporal because the other primaries really just don't offer anything for science builds like this. For your secondary, strategist is your best option pretty much for the same reason. The other specializations just really don't offer that much for this build type. Now, an important part of all of these science builds is going to be a secondary deflector. One isn't 100% necessary to pull most of these off, but you really want one to get the most out of it. What secondary deflectors do is interact with certain science abilities to make them more powerful. The abilities in question will depend on the type of secondary deflector you use. There are three types: deteriorating, inhibiting, and resonating. Deteriorating secondary deflectors enhance debuff abilities, and apply a moderate amount of radiation damage over time to said abilities. Inhibiting secondary deflectors will do the same thing for control abilities, and resonating secondary deflectors will enhance support abilities by reducing shield damage and improving heals. Which one you use will depend on which abilities you want to focus more on with your build, and by which one, I'm really just talking about the deteriorating and inhibiting secondary deflectors, because the heal buffs from that resonating deflector aren't going to help anyone, trust me. There are a bunch of all three of these out there in the game, but your best options are either going to come from the Fleet Research Lab or the Fleet Colony, so you're going to want to be in a fleet that has access to these, or have a friend that can send you an invite to one. Now, let's get into the specific build types of these science builds. We'll start with EPG builds. As I said earlier, EPG stands for Exotic Particle Generator. That name comes from the skill that's going to determine the damage of your exotic abilities. These builds are focused on dealing DPS with exotic damage. EPG builds largely focus around the ability Gravity Well. This is because a lot of your science abilities and your universal consoles are going to be dealing a lot of AoE damage. But those AoEs only get so big, so you're going to keep your enemies clustered in one area, hence the Gravity Well. But other than that, a lot of your abilities are actually going to be debuffing abilities, which is why you'll be wanting a deteriorating secondary deflector. The idea is to hold your enemies with Gravity Well, and then just bombard them with exotic damage from your universal consoles and the radiation damage that will be done by your secondary deflector. For your ship's specialization seating, temporal is best for EPG builds, because a good amount of temporal abilities actually deal exotic damage, so they often pair well with science builds. Full-on temporal ships are actually the best because the molecular deconstruction beam has a support configuration, which buffs your auxiliary power, your exotic damage, and your control expertise, all of which are very valuable skills for any science build. That said, these are not required for any sort of science build, so don't feel like you actually need to go out of your way to get a temporal ship. Now, I've been talking a lot about skills and consoles and secondary deflectors, but what about your weapons? Well, they do take a bit of a back seat with EPG builds, which ones you pick are still going to be important. EPG builds typically work best with torpedoes, particularly torpedoes that have some sort of exotic proc to them, like the gravimetric torpedo, the particle emissions plasma torpedo, or the dark matter torpedo. There are others too, but these are the three I'm using on this build. Torpedoes work best with these science builds because using energy weapons requires you to split your power levels. With a science build, you're going to want to keep your auxiliary power maxed out for the sake of those science abilities, which means you're not going to be able to put as much power into weapons, and any energy weapons you have equipped will suffer because of that. Torpedoes don't really have that problem, because their damage isn't determined by the amount of your weapon's power. Now, using energy weapons is doable on these sort of builds, but they require some changes. Enough that they're actually referred to as a completely different build type, DEW-Sci Builds. But before I get to those, I want to talk about control builds first. And that's because control builds are actually very similar to EPG builds. The biggest difference is instead of focusing on your exotic particle generator skill, you're going to be focusing on control expertise. An EPG build is designed to kill things with exotic damage, whereas a control build is designed to contain enemies at a certain spot, so they don't wander around. This is often done with Gravity Well and other control abilities, which is why with this you'll probably want an inhibiting secondary deflector, though depending on your build you could also stick with the deteriorating deflector as well. Because control builds are more focused on containing an enemy rather than killing it, they're really more of a support build. They're also really only necessary in certain elite TFOs, so I wouldn't worry about setting one up if you prefer sticking to the advanced queues. Now, DEW-Sci builds are a bit different. DEW-Scis are directed energy weapon science builds. They're a bit more niche these days, but they're still certainly doable. They're basically EPG or control build depending on which way you want to focus, but with energy weapons. Like I said earlier, the issue with science builds and energy weapons is that you're going to have to split your power levels between your auxiliary and your weapon subsystem. This is why you're going to want to buff your subsystems as much as possible. This is why I would recommend doing one of these on a ship with intel seating. That way you have access to override subsystem safeties. Now, available weapon slots are going to be a bit more important than they would be with a normal EPG or control build that's using torpedoes. Energy weapons tend to work better the more you have firing all at once, which is why it's usually best to have a ship with at least 4 weapon slots in the front. There are only a handful of science ships with 4 weapon slots in the front, and even less with that plus an intel seat. In fact, the only 2 I can think of off the top of my head are the Crossfield and the Bowel Sentry ship. Now, I'm not saying you have to use either of those 2 ships for a DEW-Sci build, but they are probably your best choices. Of course, those are lockbox ships, and therefore are pretty expensive. You could probably pull off a decent one on the Equinox. It's a C-Store ship, so it's easy to get. It has 4 weapon slots in the front. It doesn't have an intel seat, but it is a scout ship, so it's got a ton of universal seating. Now there's one last science build type I want to talk a little bit about. Drain builds. Drain builds, like their name suggests, focus on draining power levels and resistances away from enemy targets. They're very niche these days just because there isn't much need for them in the current state of the game. They're only really necessary in elite TFOs, and they've kind of fallen out of favor as a support build in favor of just a standard tank and control setup or a full-blown nanny build setup. They also take a bit of effort to set up, by which I mean they have a lot of specific needs. Now, truth be told, I actually don't fully understand how drain builds work, so I'm not going to really be able to tell you a lot about them. However, my friend JB over at Pirate Scum Gaming just did a build video on his drain build, so if you're curious to learn more about drain builds, go check that out. I'll link it down in the description below. Also, be sure to hit the subscribe button. I'm sure JB would appreciate it. So yeah, those are the basics for EPG and other science-heavy builds. I hope it helps you in making your own. With this video done, I'll be moving on to the tank build basics next, and then that will wrap it up for this series. If you saw my community post from about like a week and a half ago, at least as of filming this, you already know what I'm probably going to be moving on to. But if you have any suggestions or comments for upcoming content, feel free to comment on that as well. I'll link that down below in the description. Anyway, my name's Stu, and I don't want to put it on again. Sub to my YouTube channel or I will pick you in the face like a bird!